Good evening, everyone. And yes, it is me in the flesh, not popping up on your computer or annoying you on your phone. My name is Jean-Pierre Oriol. I am the Commissioner for the Department of Planning and Natural Resources. And I am here to welcome you all to our second Town Hall meeting for the Virgin Islands Comprehensive Land and Water Use Plan. Thank you for being here, showing your commitment to the planning for the future of our Virgin Islands. I am just doing some brief welcoming remarks, giving a little bit of an overview of how tonight's town hall will proceed. I'll be turning it over to Jeff and Nate from the Horsley Witten Group, who we have been working with for the last several months in accomplishing the plan. So I really just want to say thank you again for all of you. If this is your second meeting for the participation on the first meetings, we had an overwhelming turnout on all three islands, and I'm very, very appreciative of that. And it shows that the Virgin Islands really has commitment behind finally accomplishing the task of executing a comprehensive land and water use plan. So tonight is going to be a little bit different than the first set of meetings were. In the first set of meetings, we gathered things that we wanted to make sure that we understood were important to all of you. Tonight, I think what we're doing, or not that I think what we're doing, but what we're doing now is we want to make sure that we captured your thoughts, your ideas, your values, your passions, and we've sort of put them into different formative issues that you'll see surrounding around the room. And Jeff and Nate will explain in more detail what we're asking you to do this evening under each of those formative issues. I'd like to recognize my staff, all of the DPN&R folks that are here tonight, helping facilitate this process. I also want to say thank you to Nicole Tyson and the NT Media Group. I think she's done an absolutely wonderful job of plastering me everywhere, making sure that every room that we go into right now is either at or near capacity. So again, welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your commitment to planning for the U.S. Virgin Islands, St. John specifically. And now I will turn it over to Jeff.
Thank you, JP. Yes, a round of applause. And a round of applause for yourselves. Thank you for being here. So I myself am really, truly humbled to be before you today and to be given the opportunity to speak in this space where the camera can now see me. Obviously our team is not from here. We're from away, we're from the States, and it's really our pleasure and our privilege to be able to serve you in this way. And I really want to reiterate that that's why we're here. We're not here to give you all the answers. We're here to hear from you, to listen to all of you, and to hope to distill all of your goals for the community into this plan. So before we begin, wanted to start with just a little refresher on where we've been and how we got to where we are today, particularly for those of you who may be joining us for the first time. Next slide, please. So first of all, many of you over the years may have gotten familiar with the acronym CLWUP, which was a big mouthful, the shorthand for Comprehensive Land and Water Use Plan. So from here on out, you're likely to hear the term comp plan rather than CLWUP, which we hope will be a lot easier to say and to understand. So when you hear comp plan, we're talking about the Comprehensive Land and Water Use Plan. Next slide, please. So the territory has been at this for a long time, literally decades of attempting to develop a comp plan and adopt it through the legislature. And I know that a number of people across the territory have been involved in past efforts. I would just like a show of hands. How many of you have worked on past comp plan efforts? Lots of hands. So a round of applause for everyone who just raised your hand. Thank you for not giving up on this project. Thank you for not giving up on your community and for continuing to come to the table. That's just huge, and I have so much respect for all of you. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the comp plan and past efforts, just a little bit of a background on what the comp plan is. So the comp plan is a shared vision for the USVI's future and a roadmap that guides how we all get there together. Really, it's a document that helps us make decisions about what new development looks like and where it happens, or where it doesn't happen, where are the areas that we want to conserve, how we balance competing uses for our waters, such as boating, fishing, and swimming, public access to our shores, how to protect environmentally sensitive areas, our waters, our coastlines, and historic sites, prioritizing future investments in community services and infrastructure in a way that's equitable, in a way where everyone in the community benefits from those investments, making sure, and this is very important, that the land and water use decision-making process is fair, equitable, and consistent, and that all of you can be involved in that decision-making process. So I will apologize in advance. The comprehensive plan, as it suggests, is comprehensive. It covers a lot of ground, and there's a lot of information tonight, and we've tried our best to distill it to bite-sized pieces that are understandable. But just want to note that although it does cover a lot of topics, these topics are primarily in regard to how these things impact land and water use and management. So for example, healthcare and education will be discussed, but generally in regard to how we locate our healthcare facilities, how we locate our public schools, and how we can make sure people can access them and get from place to place. Also, I want to be clear that the comp plan is not in and of itself the territory's land use and zoning laws. So it's a framework for future legislation. It is a framework for how we make decisions together as a community. Next slide, please. All right. So the commissioner mentioned formative issues, and I just want to give you a little bit of background about what those are and how they were created. So the plan is required to cover certain topics, but we really wanted to build the plan around the things that matter most to you. So that's why we started the first round of town halls by listening and hearing from you as to what is most important for you to preserve, to improve, to transform throughout the territory. And we heard from literally hundreds of people across the territory and started hearing a lot of similar ideas. So what we've done with the formative issues is try to take the most common things we heard and start putting them into these buckets, these formative issues. And that's really just all they are, the things that we've heard most from you categorized. And these are going to serve as the pillars of the plan. So we have worked through these and refined them with working groups. There's a working group on each of the 3 islands, and I want to take a moment to thank all the working group members who are here today. If you wouldn't mind raising your hand. Hey, thank you everyone on the working group for providing your volunteerism. We really appreciate it. Next slide, please. So, on top of talking to the working group, we did have an online public survey asking people for their feedback on the formative issues. Did we hear correctly? Does this resonate with you? I will say we had a pretty abysmal response rate to the online survey, and we want to be honest about that as we go forward when public engagement is successful, and when it was not as successful. This was not as successful, but the comments we got back were really good, really substantive, and I think really consistent with what we had been hearing from people in person, and by and large very supportive of the formative issues. The one big thing that we were told is that we were not paying enough attention to water uses, that we were paying too much attention to land uses. So we really tried to go back to the drawing board and make sure that water uses were more prominent throughout the formative issues. And again, our goal for tonight is to hear from you as to whether you think we're on target and if there are things that you think are missing or that we should be doing differently. So things that we heard from the working group, one, that we need to be supplementing these online surveys with more on-the-ground engagement. So events like this where neighbors can talk to neighbors and have these conversations in person. We need to focus more on people, culture, and heritage, and how all these land uses and development decisions impact the culture here. A very strong encouragement to emphasize government transparency and accountability, as well as the capacity of government staff to do the job that they're tasked with doing. And I will say that all the formative issues in their full form are currently on the website, which is www.planusvi.com. Next slide. Next, more opportunities for local decision making. And I will say that that came strongest here on St. John, a very strong and clear desire for there to be more mechanisms for decisions that impact St. John to be made by St. Johnians locally. There are also a number of specific environmental concerns, an emphasis on regeneration, sustainability, and not just for the conservation of natural resources, but being more sustainable in the way that we do development. And again, we heard loud and clear, more of an emphasis on water uses. So speaking of government accountability and transparency, that was a huge theme from everyone that we've heard from, and also this issue of how decisions are made locally and how we can make our government more accountable to the public. So based on a lot of the feedback that we've heard, we've come up with a list of principles which we hope will overarch everything else that this plan does. Whatever actions we decide collectively to pursue through this plan, we hope they'll be filtered through these principles. Next slide, please. So, first and foremost, to set goals. I know some of these are going to seem really simple, but I think it's important. A lot of people saying, we want to know when you have a policy, when you make a program, what is it you're trying to accomplish? Be very clear about that up front. What are you trying to achieve? Next, to collect data. If you're going to know if you've achieved what you want to achieve, you have to have baseline information from where you've started, and you have to collect that data to know if you're making progress towards your goals. Next, to be accountable. This issue of government accountability is huge, and to make sure that as we're trying programs, as we are exploring legislation, that we're collecting this data, and if it's not working, hold ourselves accountable and say, hey, this wasn't working the way we thought it would. We need to try something different. We need to make adjustments along the way. Next, to act equitably. So there's a lot of disparity in outcomes throughout the territory. And we want decision makers to constantly be asking who's likely to benefit from this decision and who's not. And to make sure that everyone, or as many people as possible, are benefiting from the investments and the decisions that are being made. Next, an emphasis on minding the future. So we know that droughts are getting worse. We know that storms are becoming more frequent and more severe. We know that, I guess, there are a number of issues with sea level rise and so on and so on and so on, that if we're not taking that into consideration today, we're not going to have good results into the future. So really being mindful of those things as we're making those decisions today. And then finally, being willing to embrace change. We heard from a lot of people that it seems a lot of action in the territory happens over and over and over and over and over again, somehow expecting a different result. And it needs to be okay to try new things, to experiment, and hold yourself accountable. And if you fail, it's okay, just so long as you keep moving on and keep testing and keep all those other principles in mind. So when we were sharing these ideas with the working groups, they said, we'd really love to see an example of this. What would this look like in the real world? Next slide. So we say, okay, here's an example that we were recently reading in the news. The governor has proposed a bill that would help rehabilitate derelict and abandoned properties, but with the goal of making sure that there's not a change in ownership, that people who have owned these properties for generations are able to maintain them even as they're being renovated. So is this a good idea? It sounds like a good idea, but how will we know? Next slide, please. So this is just an example, completely hypothetical, of how you might test an idea that could be in a plan like this. So first of all, set goals. What are we trying to accomplish with this? 1, we want to fix buildings. 2, we want to make sure that people don't lose their homes, right? So we can set targets. Say we want a 50% reduction in derelict and abandoned buildings within 10 years. And let's say that we want to make sure that at least 90% of the people who participate in this program are able to stay in their homes. Maybe it's 100%. Next, collecting data. We have to first know what the baseline inventory is. How many derelict and abandoned buildings are there in the territory? We need to track the investments that are made over time and track property owner data. And in terms of being accountable, is it working or not? With that data, we can tell the number of buildings that have been renovated. We'll know how many people have been able to maintain their homes and how many have been, have lost their property through this process, and where we need to make adjustments. So you can learn and change. And again, it's okay to fail so long as you're honest about it and make adjustments along the way. In terms of acting equitably, again, we have to ask ourselves, who's benefiting, who's not? And to do that, we have to track the demographic data of property owners. Are outcomes different for lower income property owners versus higher income property owners? Are outcomes different based on the property owner's race? If the answer is yes, then something's wrong. We've got to go back to the drawing board. Mind the future. We have to make sure that these homes are being built back better, that they're weatherproofed, that they're energy efficient, that they can withstand storms in the future, and so on and so forth, and be accessible and available for our children and grandchildren and the next generation. So yes, I think we need to be able to embrace change, and you won't know until you try if something's going to work, and that's okay as long as you test and refine. And we really hope that whatever we pursue as a community will apply these principles so that you can explore changes as a community and have a better platform for making decisions together. So I'm sorry, that was a mouthful, but with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague Nate, who's going to take you through very high level some of the policy directions that we've compiled for each of the formative issues.
Thank you, Jeff. How's my position, cameraman? All right, thank you. So as JP alluded to earlier, you know, many of you were here in this room when we had our first town hall, and we've had those on the other major islands, and we heard a lot of stories. We heard a lot of concerns. We heard a lot of hopes, and things were written down on paper. Things were just told to us. We had a big pile of amazing material and feedback to work with. And the work that we've done to date is to distill those into these 10 major topics, these formative issues, which if you get on the plan website, you'll see sort of a paragraph sort of describing what we think we heard and articulating that, and our working groups helped us to sort of refine the language there, and those are there for review. But we need to get more crisp. We need to get more concise on how we present these formative issues. So we've got these one to two sentence guiding principles that really just tries to get to the heart of the matter, and then some policies and strategies. Next slide. So again, 1 to 2 sentence, the policy direction, those guiding principles sounds like a goal. It sounds like what we are aspiring to. And these principles start to lay that roadmap that Jeff mentioned. How do we get there? How do we achieve that? Next slide. And then working strategies, we're sort of giving you a taste. Again, our process for this entire plan is to try to bring everybody along with this material development as we go. So we have these, we started way up high with all of this material. We came down a little bit closer to the ground with these formative issues, guiding principles, and we're given a little bit of taste of the strategies that are going to be the final piece of this plan as we go forward. So again, we've started from, you know, a big pile of material and we're crystallizing that into something that will eventually become the, you know, the final plan. This all comes from a variety of sources beyond the conversations with you. Remember, the territory has an agricultural plan, a transportation plan. It has the previous efforts related to adopting a comp plan. There's a lot of material to work with, so we're pulling from you all, we're pulling from past efforts and adopted plans, we're pulling from expertise and interviews, all coming to this point right now. Next slide, please. So I am going to do something I don't usually do a lot of. I'm going to read a lot from these slides directly because language is important here at this point in the project. And I'm going to read each one of these policies, these guiding principles as we go through, give you a quick taste of some of the items that you'll see on the boards. This is not a full list of everything that we're working with now. You'll see more material as you go around the room later, but I'll walk through these one by one. There's 10 of these. I'll try to move quickly, but really give you an idea of what we've been looking at. The first one we have here is governing effectively. So decisions related to land and water use should be based on sound planning and enforced by agencies with adequate resources. That is what we're thinking, the crystallization of all these ideas, all these stories of what people have been talking about with good governance, good regulation, good planning moving forward. That's our guiding principle there. Some examples of the policy directions is to just make sure government agencies are fully staffed and trained. This is something that is not the reality right now in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So having those resources for government agencies to do the work is going to be critical to governing effectively. On the flip side of that is accountability. Once this plan makes it to the legislature, and if we can get this plan adopted, this plan needs to survive from one administration to the next. So we have to build in mechanisms that hold the legislature, that hold decision makers accountable to this plan. So for example, if a zoning change request is made, that zoning change cannot be granted or denied without an examination of this plan as it's adopted. This is the reference point. It cannot be arbitrary. It cannot be done because somebody thinks it's a good idea. It has to be done in reference to this plan. Next. Celebrating our history and culture, restoring, healing, preserving, and cultivating awareness of cultural resources in land and water use policy is critical to the economic success of the U.S. Virgin Islands and the cultural experience of future generations. Some examples of how we would get there in terms of our broad policies is ensuring that development proposals account for and sometimes enhance cultural resources where it's possible, using traditional and culturally recognized building and site design techniques. Reinvesting in our history. One of the problems that we heard about again and again here is that folks who own historic buildings or who have property with historic resources, cultural resources, do not have access to the capital that they need to restore these buildings, to enhance that land. So these programs need to be structured in a way where folks who may be, land rich and don't have a lot in the bank account have access to capital up front so that they can make the kind of investments that will be good for them as property owners and be good for the islands as a whole because you are maintaining that heritage within the landscape. Next, please. Providing homes for everyone. I was at the market today and we were passing out flyers and spoke with a woman. And she said, well, what are some of the things you're going to talk about? And I said, well, we're going to talk about housing, for example. And she said, are you going to talk about the fact that no one can afford a house? Can no one afford to buy a house on this island? I said, yes, that is exactly what we're going to talk about. Our guiding principle here is a diverse and abundant supply of safe and healthy homes is fundamental to the economic, social, and environmental prosperity of the U.S. Virgin Islands. To make this happen, one of the things we need flexible zoning. If a young family is fortunate enough to buy a home or inherits a home, that home needs to serve them when they're a couple. That home needs to serve them when they're kids. That home needs to serve them when the kids move out and they age. They can age potentially into disability. They may need extra income through rental. They may need income health care. They need for their kids to move back. That single home has to be able to do this over time. Flexibility in zoning is needed to allow that to happen. Probate reform is something that we heard about again and again and again. Properties stuck in probate cannot resolve issues around ownership. If you cannot resolve issues around ownership, you cannot reinvest. You cannot move that property forward. You cannot create prosperity in that environment. Next, please. Connecting people, commerce, and places. The transportation system should serve the needs of all residents and visitors with different options for getting around, and it should connect land and water uses in a safe, efficient, and environmentally sensitive way. Policy examples might start with walkability, just simply being able to walk around safely with the use of sidewalks, paths where that's potentially applicable, just to get people in an easy, safe way to walk between neighborhoods, schools, shopping, and other services. For those of you who may have been involved in the planned Cruise Bay charrette, this was a central theme, being able to walk around this particular area in a way that's, again, safe and enjoyable. This idea of more sustainable roadways create stormwater runoff. They create pollution. Roadways can almost become a gut, during a major storm event, draining water in massive volumes in a way that does not recharge aquifers, in a way that can do incredible damage to surface waters, erosion, damage to mangrove and coral and seagrass. All of these really important natural resources comes back many times to the way we design and maintain our roads. Next, please. Natural resources. Land and water use policies must reflect that the U.S. Virgin Islands natural resources are central to local cultural identity, public health, ecological systems, and economic well-being. This touches on every aspect of life, everyday life, economic, social, cultural, health. This is ingrained in what the Virgin Islands experience is, both for people who live here and for people who visit. To get to a point where we are adequately protecting natural resources, development review has to be enhanced. Reviewing environmental impacts associated with development and water use permits, land and watership practices should regenerate the environment where that's possible. There's a lot of old legacy developments on these islands that was built in a way that folks weren't really thinking about environmental impacts at that time. Redeveloping those sites, investing in those sites can actually create a net benefit moving forward. Groundwater protection, you have been facing a massive drought here. It is just not raining enough right now, and it's hard to tell how drastic that's going to be in the future. So managing land use in a way that recharges clean water into your groundwater reserves is going to be critical moving forward. Next, please. Improving and maintaining quality of life. Land and water use policies should support a sustainable system of public amenities and services that foster civic responsibility, public health equity, opportunities for physical activity, and community pride. So how do we get that to happen? One is access to health facilities. Jeff mentioned, we're not going to talk about the healthcare system necessarily and healthcare policy, but we certainly are going to talk about where it's located and how to get there and get access. So identifying locations for the expansion of healthcare services on each of the major islands. Public shoreline and water access as a recreational amenity, as a right, as a daily experience for U.S. Virgin Islands, maintaining that access going forward. Next, please. Mitigating the impacts of climate change. The U.S. Virgin Islands must adopt land and water use policies that anticipate the impacts of our changing climate and strengthen our ability to meet these challenges. This is the minding the future that Jeff talked about earlier. Resilient development, so new construction, renovations, and infrastructure need to be built to withstand storms to the maximum extent possible, sea level rise, and other climate impacts, including heat. We need to think about heat management in our buildings, in our public spaces going forward. Protecting our trees, this sounds so simple again, but in our conversations, we learned about the amazing relationship that U.S. Virgin Islanders have with their trees. This is part of your memories, this is part of your culture, this is part of your food. So this was really something that was special for us as we learned about your stories. And protecting those trees is a cultural, sort of spiritual connection piece, but it's also one for climate change. Trees provide shade, trees mitigate heat, trees absorb carbon, trees absorb reduce stormwater impacts. They are an amazing, natural, beautiful resource that we need to be thinking about as we go forward. Next, please. Building economic opportunity and resilience. Our policies will look to diversify the U.S. Virgin Islands economy and build on the strengths and the opportunities specific to the different islands in these territories. Every island here has something different to offer, has a different cultural experience, has different economic strengths, has different resources, has different ideas. Economic development here should tap into that, should build on those strengths going forward. So we should prioritize policies that expand opportunity and, again, access to capital for landowners, residents, and small business. And then growing a food economy here. We learned so much about the push here, the momentum that you have here with the agricultural plan and all of the work that's been going into thinking about the food system, growing the food, processing the food, distributing the food, cooking the food, serving the food, and then what do you do with the waste? Thinking in a circular fashion here of what can happen with a more sustainable food economy. Right now, I believe the number is 97% of your food comes from off island. That's something that can change going forward. Next. Sustainability and stewardship. Build infrastructure, provide everyday services to residents and businesses in an equitable and sustainable manner that serves the needs of current and future residents and visitors while promoting biodiversity, restoring ecosystems in the environment, and improving public health. There's a lot going on there. What does that mean from a policy perspective? Well, one, some resilient power implementation is certainly in order here. We heard a lot about, we experienced our own blackouts while we were here. So continuing to build a more resilient and reliable power grid, using microgrids, battery storage, burying utilities, using composite poles rather than wooden utility poles, piece by piece, making that system more resilient as you go forward. And water supply, this is going to be, again, with the drought issues that you're having here, thinking about how you manage water in a much more sophisticated manner, adopting development standards and design standards so that, both there's the sort of centralized aspect of it, but there's also the piece by piece, property by property, and we need to think about how we treat, store, and conserve our water supplies. Next, please. I believe this is the last one here. Development, redevelopment, restoration, and conservation. This sort of brings it all together. This is that land and water use piece. All those things I just talked about, governance, getting around, housing, public services, the job of this plan is to translate that into maps that shows where this should happen. What are we looking forward to in the future, where and how? So a future land and water management policy would simply be, I say simply, identify areas suitable for different types of development and uses, areas that most need conservation, and areas that should be targeted for restoration, both in land and in water. Walkable mixed-use communities. getting back to the zoning. Your zoning's been around a long time, hasn't really had a comprehensive reform in decades. We're in a new century. You have bold needs in this territory. You need to think big, and your zoning has to reflect the kinds of communities that you want to develop. So establishing zoning and incentives for mixed-use development, flexible development, to create walkable communities that are close to retail, services, daily needs, allow you to gather, meet your friends, building those kind of communities that foster community. Next, please. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Krista, who's just going to do one more slide to talk about the material here and how you're going to walk through it, and then we'll have an opportunity to chat real quick. We can take a few questions, but we'll be here for a bit, and we also want to talk with you at each of the stations. Krista, you have to stand right there.
Good evening, thank you. I know, deep breath, right? That was a lot, and there's more out there. So as Nate mentioned, we have these sort of stations set up, so we have a board for each one of the formative issues that he went through. So we have, and I'm just going to point through just so you get familiar. So we have our formative issue topic, our goal, our principle, all these terms we're going to learn tonight. Our principal statement is here, and then sort of draft policy directions. So these are our bold statements here, and they're numbered, but that is not a sense of priority. They're just there to, as I'll explain how you're going to give feedback for us. And then under each one, we have 2 working strategies to sort of illustrate what that would look like, how that would happen. We obviously are thinking of other ideas, but for tonight, just to sort of manage all of this information that you're going to try to process, we have 2 examples under each. And so we're looking for feedback, and I'm going to step out of the camera for a moment. And so we have a couple of different ways you could provide feedback. So tonight we have these sheets, and you can fill out the topic, the formative issue that you're interested in, and we have a spot for the policy number. So if you wanted to comment on something specific here, you could do that. If you want to give some feedback on if you agree with it, if you don't, and we have some space down here if you want to write some comments. You know, are we sort of off track? What are we missing? If there's something you want to make sure we include that you don't see here, you can do that. And then we've got 3 spots on here. You could also do this later. If you wanted to take this home with you, you could do that. You can drop it off at the library. Ms. Richards has agreed to collect these for us. You could also go online. So there's a code on here at the website. There's cards that you can take with you. You can hand them to your neighbors, to your friends, to your family. They can also fill it out later too. And we'll be collecting all of this for a couple of weeks through August 6th. And if you don't find a sheet or you run out of sheets, I have a good old-fashioned notepad up here. I'm happy to take any comments that you have as well. And I just have one more thing. So we have these are getting to know you surveys. They're anonymous, and if you would be willing, so what we're just asking who's here. This helps us know who we're not reaching, so we can follow up and make sure we're hearing from folks that aren't here tonight. So this just gives us a sense of who showed up, so we can do some follow-up. So that would be great if you could fill that out for us. So at the end of the evening, if you have some sheets that you want to turn in, so anyone with the name tag, you can give it to them, or you can leave it at the sign-in table. And if you hadn't signed in, please do that. We can put your email on our list if you don't already receive our updates. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nate.
So before we all, and I see people writing down who they are. Thank you so much for that. Again, we want to have people get up and circulate up behind us on the stage. Ramp over there, stairs here, mind the cord. We've taped it down, but be careful. So we'll have folks with name tags at each of these places who can help you think about this and answer your questions. But before we do that, I just wanted to give anyone an opportunity here. So if they had something that they wanted everybody else to hear, or a question that they wanted everyone else to hear them ask, they can do that. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the example which you cited to see whether or not the plan would actually work. You cited an example that there might have been proposed legislation having to do with refurbishing buildings and keeping the occupants in those buildings. And you asked the question, how do we know if that's good? And then the answer you gave seemed to look at the future outcome of it, saying, well, you know, what are we going to measure and look over time? But that's kind of doesn't help you at the time that the legislation is proposed. Then you're just speculating on what it might do. So I kind of was confused in the time frames between when a policy is proposed, how you assess it against the plan, and what's the feedback loop to know if you made a mistake and correct things. So does that make sense to you?
I think it does, and I think, and I'm not dodging the question, but I think it depends, right? Because each of these policies, you know, there's going to literally be dozens and dozens of policies that emerge out of this plan. And some of them may be broader and more complex than others. So I think in terms of planning, you know, for more complex policies, for example, if we're talking about local representation, we're literally talking about changing the structure of government. That's going to take a lot of thought and goal setting in advance to decide what are we actually trying to accomplish, because that new structure really has to try to reflect that. So that's an example of where that goal setting piece I think is going to take a lot longer time. The feedback mechanism would be through the citizenry, that you would have to customize the feedback system to see if people are satisfied with it as it's going forward and what's not working. So I think that's an example of one that's, you know, much more complex. Another one might have to do with roadway repair, and that's probably a little more straightforward, right? So that's something that, you know, DPW could write a pavement management plan and set very specific goals, very numeric, you know, and sort of move through that and say at the end of a year, report back to the legislature and said, well, we set this goal and we fell short by 5%, or we exceeded by 10%, or whatever that is. So that would be a little bit different. So I think it depends on the complexity and the ability to measure these goals. Some things are a lot easier to measure. So again, I think it's going to depend.
So I didn't explain it perfectly clearly, but the development in the territory tends to be very transactional. Someone comes along and says, I want to build a hotel, or someone wants to do a subdivision, or an industrial site wants to be built. And that transaction is generally evaluated in terms of, will it create jobs? Does it create economic benefit? And as an afterthought, someone might look at, as you say, a very thick, dense plan for the territory and say, is it or is it not consistent with that plan? But that is usually an afterthought. It doesn't usually go into the decision-making on that transaction. And so I'm wondering how you can be more proactive. Say, you know, if there is a transaction, whether it's a piece of legislation or a change in government structure or a proposed development, can you score it somehow against the plan? Can you say, you know, what is the consistency of this with respect to our adopted plan? And can you then have thresholds and say, if it's not consistent, it won't go forward?
I think that's something that you can certainly explore. You know, checklists, thresholds, scorecards are things that nothing, you know, I can't think of a community off the top of my head, but in our experience, we've seen those types of things implemented. But it's interesting that, I mean, yes, development is transactional, but right now you have a set of, I think I used this metaphor in our first round, you have a set of development regulations that's like a house without a foundation. And so this plan has to be that foundation, you know, going forward. Development isn't going to be, if this plan is adopted, development is not going to be transactional. Development is going to be set by the zoning, which is reformed in accordance with the vision set forward in this plan. So developers, property owners will be answering to this vision. It will take a couple of years to get all of that into place. Regulatory reform is challenging, but you need this foundation first to make that happen. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening. I listened to you. I came here tonight to find out about your plans for folks that own a little bit of property. You know, St. John has a finite amount of land that is livable, really, the rest of the national park. And I am pleased what you said about the mixed use with housing. But I gotta tell you that that may sound good, but it's not so simple. And as a former legislator, I know that there are families here who had a small amount of property, wanted to do something for their family, and we had to rezone it. And you're going to be faced with a whole lot of that because it's just not that much land to go around. The good thing I heard you say, though, is, and I believe this is what you're saying, that we got to start planning about building up instead of just across, because we just don't have that much property. So I have a question. Are you saying that when you're looking at the zoning now, you want to change the zoning of what we live here, what we use?
I think after this plan is written, and if this plan is adopted, there will be zoning changes to follow.
Yes, and are you talking about building up more?
In some places where it's appropriate, yeah.
Right
In
on.
some places, it's not appropriate. So, you know, identifying, that's part of what this plan will do, is say, yes, we can build up more here, we can provide more opportunity, we can provide more housing, we can provide more growth in this particular area.
One last thing. St. John is a place where, as I grew up, there were places that people would know that this represents St. John. The dock facility. That's a place where everybody comes in, everybody's aware of that. We know when you come to St. John, this is where you come in. But I heard there's a lot of discussion about moving it someplace else. I don't agree with that. That's not who we are. It changes who we are. It changes the reason why people come to this place. And I think you got to take that into consideration when you're doing your plans, that a lot of folks came here because of how we live. They want a different kind of life. I don't want you in your plans to try to change that and make us a quote-unquote concrete jungle. We got to stay who we are, but find a way to, make the changes because life goes on, is a new world. Mm-hmm. Just keep that in mind. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I saw a hand up in the front row here, I thought. Yes, so we're going to bring a mic. He asked your question, okay. Yes, miss.
Well, I was more or less on his scale there about St. John, because I'm kind of slow, and this seems so general, and I was hoping that you were talking about St. John per se, and where the changes that you think you want to propose or something like that. And I didn't hear anything like that.
Yeah,
so I'm kind of lost here.
No, I mean, I think that's a valid point. What we're doing with this process is moving step by step. So yes, we will get to a point where we are making very specific recommendations for land and water use in St. John. We're about halfway through our process. So what we're presenting you tonight are the policy directions. When you read the boards tonight, I think you'll see some things that are specific to St. John, but we're moving along, and you're probably, in your brain, a little bit ahead of us in our process now. Yes, sir. We got a microphone.
Sorry, thank you. You mentioned history and culture. My question is, where do you begin to identify the history and the culture? What is your starting point to identify those parameters, may I ask?
We have done it through both research and community conversation, basically. So anything that's come out of, SHPO with the historic folks. We have Kurt Marsh on our team, who's part of the Historic Commission, I believe the chair of the Historic Commission at this point. So we've had both like community walking tours where we've looked at different historic resources. So again, it's been a combination of on the ground, talking with folks about what they know, their personal knowledge, and then also research into some of the more official documents around, say, the historic district and those sorts of things.
One final question. I can appreciate that, but I haven't heard anything mentioned about the transfer from Denmark to the United States that has established a situation on these particular islands. I've heard no one mention it because that has a very great impact on people that have it, the people that live there and their properties. But I haven't heard anybody even reference that. Can you respond to that?
I think that's something that we should highlight. I think, the legacy of ownership, whether it was transferred to the U.S. or the Dutch, Spain, all of the different impositions, colonialism, slavery, all of the things that happened along the way to impose other cultures and transfer from one culture to the next, that certainly has to be part of the discussion. It's left a legacy here in the landscape. It's left a legacy here in the mindset and the way people talk and think and what they value. So I agree. And if that's not something that you see tonight, then that needs to be elevated. Yes, sir. Can we get you a microphone? Sorry. Just especially for the folks at home.
Well, is that better?
Thank you.
I'm glad to see that you're holding this meeting, and it suggests to me that local input, which I did not see mentioned on any of the slides, is nevertheless important to you. And since there are so many people here tonight, one of the major development proposals, which has been going on now for 9 years, it's not resolved. I'm curious if, based on the number of people here tonight, how many people here are in favor of the Summers End Mega Yacht Marina proposed, which will cover most of Coral Bay?
Well, that's certainly something people can comment on. And our natural resource protection and water use, tell us what you think of the Summers End proposal.
Well, I'm one person who's seriously against it, and I'm rather knowledgeable about the place and the subject. And I'm just curious right now, how many people here are interested in it? Anybody here for the marina?
All right. Yeah, this is, we don't want to make this a meeting about, it's an important water use question, but we can't make the whole meeting about that particular topic. But we would like to get your feedback on that tonight through the mechanisms that we provided.
All right, I think I got my answer.
All right, can we pass the mic to this gentleman here? Yes, sir.
Good evening. With your plan, one of the things that I would like to see is that you identify locations on each island where they can have what they call man-made ponds and lake retention systems, because everyone talks about aquifers, but no one understands the fact that aquifers have to be replenished. And if you don't have a sustainable system to replenish the wells and stuff like that, they don't function. The government has spent a whole lot of money here in St. John, putting in one time a whole lot of wells up into the middle of the island. But when I watch them do it, I laugh, because I said, basically, if you don't have a system built into that to help replenish and recharge the system, it's a waste of money. And I think the government a long time ago should have actually made a survey on the islands as to where man-made lakes, dams, or ponds could be placed in order to recharge aquifers. And water of itself actually attracts more water, you know. When I looked at St. John years ago, I realized that the Indians, when they were living here, they actually had a water supply, and it was actually up in the middle of these islands. What happened is over time, the water system, the water itself became so large a quantity that it broke out through the mountains, and it drained out to the point where it wouldn't contain water anymore. And these things can actually be reestablished to help recharge the aquifers on the islands.
Is there any resource that you can point me to on that?
If you go and you look at the topos of the islands, you can actually tell where in the past there were actually lakes in place in the mountains.
Right.
And basically, if you go on this island, if you go to Fish Bay and you look up into the mountains, you're going to see an area where it was like a great waterfall where it tore away the mountain, and you can just see sheer rocks, cliff, where the water just tore everything away down to the solid rock. And that showed me right away when I saw that it had to have a huge charge system above it that would actually do that once it broke out, once it broke out.
Well, we'll do some digging on that. Thank you.
All right.
I think over here.
Look at this comp plan. Could someone explain to me how an area such as Wharf Side, which is currently, in my understanding, outside of the coastal zone, how does that interface with what's going on here? Or is that an area that can continue to do whatever they want to do? Is there someone that can address that?
Is there anybody who knows more about that than I do from DPN&R who can address that?
Yes, good evening. So answering your question as to whether or not there would continue to be a tier 1, tier 2 system, that is something to be placed on the table by everybody as part of the plan, what the recommendation is. If we want to do away with the tier 1, tier 2 system, this is the opportunity to tell our legislators that this is what the will of the people is. And in adoption of the plan, they would get rid of that. You know, so we know that that line was drawn with politics in mind. You can't be a stone's throw away from the water and not considered in the coastal area, but politics played a role in it, and that's why it is that way. So here's the time to reverse that. Say that we don't want, or we want a uniform coastal boundary that states this is the definitive line, this is how far inland, this is the elevation that we want to do it. There's another alternative that people have also floated over the years in which they would like to see, is that you can have a tier 1, tier 2 system for minor development, but that every single major development, and you define what a major development is, goes through the coastal management process. And that way it takes public comment, public input into consideration for every single project that we determine to be major. So those are the types of things, the ideas that we want to see that people place in terms of what's important to them. You know, maybe that's part of what you think the sustainability and stewardship is. Maybe it's part how we make change in the poster that's next to you. So I encourage you to place your idea as to whether or not you feel the tier 1, tier 2 system works for the territory.
All right, so we're at about 6:40 right now. I do want to have people with an opportunity to see everything we've got, because it's a lot of material. And just a reminder, you know, give us whatever feedback tonight you're comfortable with, but know that you have the opportunity to see all of this material on our website. There's a survey mechanism where you can go through all of these and, you know, fill out provide just more information than you might have been able to do this evening. So. Say again, Hillary? Oh, yes, or you can drop papers up at the library and they will take those for you. So, one more question?
Be interfacing what came up in the charrette at some point in this comp plan.
Yes.
I am also publicly stating that the area now where the trailers are for the school, the containers are for the school here, that was previously the Winston Wells ball field, that remains as a ball field, because in those charrette meetings, I kind of heard of development for housing, to take care of the people who come in to work in these businesses, etc. And the community, like the dock, and its meaning to this community, I take it that that field is just as important. It's an area where families meet and or used to meet and have their social gatherings and play, the men and women played ball. I know the national park has a field, but I don't think that will meet the needs. And so I'm publicly stating that that area, I am for it remaining, getting back to its original state as the field here in Cruz Bay.
All right.
Housing could go someplace else.
All right. So with that, there are some sandwiches left over. If bathrooms are out the door, up the ramp to the left, and then a right when you get to the end. So please engage with folks with a name tag and visit the posters and tell us what you think.